April 1182. The narrow streets of the Latin Quarter in Constantinople smell of bread, tar, and incense. The ordinary smells of a district that has grown rich and comfortable inside the greatest city in the Christian world. A Genoese merchant closes his shutters for the night, unaware that by morning his neighborhood will not exist. A Venetian mother pulls her children closer as she hears shouting in the distance, a sound she assumes is nothing more than another argument in the market. She is wrong. Within hours, the mob will not distinguish between soldiers and infants. Before the sun rises fully over the Bosphorus, tens of thousands of Western Christians living in Constantinople will be dead, and the fire that consumes their homes will burn for days, turning one of the wealthiest foreign quarters on earth into ash and bone. This is the story of the massacre of the Latins, a slaughter so thorough and so vicious that it would poison relations between Eastern and Western Christendom for generations, and plant the seed for a vengeance that would return 22 years later, to burn Constantinople itself to the ground. To understand how a city could turn so completely on its own neighbors, one has to understand what Constantinople had become by the 12th century. For 700 years, the city had stood as the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, the last living fragment of Rome, wealthier and more sophisticated than anything in Western Europe. Its walls had never fallen to a foreign army. Its markets moved silk, spices, and gold across 3 continents. But by the reign of Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, that ancient world had been forced to make an uneasy peace with a new one. Italian merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, had extracted extraordinary trading privileges from Byzantine emperors, desperate for naval power and loans. In exchange for ships and silver, the Italians were granted entire quarters of Constantinople, tax exemptions, and legal protections that Byzantine citizens themselves did not enjoy. By the 1170s, the Latin Quarter housed as many as 60,000 Western Christians, more Venetians, Genoese, Pisans, and other Latins living inside Constantinople than in most Western cities combined. They ran shipping. They dominated banking. They controlled the arteries of Byzantine commerce. And they had grown arrogant in their privilege, flaunting a wealth the native population could see but not touch. Resentment festered beneath the surface for decades. The Byzantines had a word for what they felt toward the Latins, and it was not affection. They saw the Italians as barbarians who had bullied their way into Holy Roman soil, heretics who worshipped with unleavened bread and answered to a pope in Rome rather than a patriarch in Constantinople, upstarts who had somehow become richer than the empire they were guests within. Manuel I, for all his diplomatic skill, had bound the empire so tightly to Italian capital and Italian ships that Byzantine merchants found themselves squeezed out of their own harbors. When Manuel died in 1180, he left behind a young son, Alexios II, only 11 years old, and a regency dominated by his widow, Maria of Antioch, a woman who was herself half Latin by birth and deeply unpopular for her perceived favoritism toward Western interests. The empire she ruled on her son's behalf was a tinderbox soaked in resentment, and all that remained was a spark. That spark arrived in the form of Andronikos Komnenos, a cousin of the late emperor, a man in his 60s who had spent much of his life in exile, scheming, seducing, and plotting his way across the courts of the Crusader states and the Muslim world before finally seeing his opportunity to seize the Byzantine throne. Andronikos understood something crucial about the mood of Constantinople. The common people despised a regency, despised the Latins who had grown fat under it, and wanted someone to blame. He marched toward the city in the spring of 1182, not as a usurper, but as a liberator, positioning himself as the defender of true Byzantine values against foreign corruption. As he approached, the population of Constantinople needed only the smallest signal that violence against the Latins would go unpunished. Andronikos gave them exactly that signal, and the city exploded. What followed was not a battle. It was an extermination carried out by ordinary people against their neighbors. The mob descended on the Latin Quarter with a speed and a savagery that suggests years of suppressed hatred, finally given permission to surface. Houses were set ablaze with families still inside them. The wealthy trading houses of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were looted and burned to their foundations, their ledgers and treasures scattered into the streets. Latin men were dragged from their homes and cut down where they stood, their bodies left in the roads for dogs. Latin women were assaulted without mercy, and children were killed alongside their parents, the mob making no distinction between combatant and infant, between merchant and priest. Hospitals sheltering the sick and elderly were stormed and their patients slaughtered in their beds, on the logic that any Latin, regardless of age or condition, deserved to die simply for existing within the city walls. The single act that came to define the massacres. Savagery involved the papal legate, Cardinal John, an elderly clergyman who represented Rome in Constantinople. The mob seized him, and in a display meant to humiliate not just the man but the entire Latin church he represented, they beheaded him and tied his severed head to the tail of a dog, dragging it through the streets of the city as a trophy of contempt. It was theater as much as murder. A message broadcast to every surviving Latin and to Rome itself. Your faith, your authority, your dignity mean nothing here. Monasteries and churches belonging to the Latin Rite were desecrated, their priests killed on the altars where they had said Mass only days before. Byzantine soldiers, rather than restoring order, joined the mob or stood aside. Some historians suggest actively assisting the slaughter rather than attempting to contain it. Ships in the harbor belonging to Italian merchants were burned at anchor, cutting off any hope of escape by sea for those who had not already been killed. The killing did not end quickly. It continued across days, spreading through the quarter street by street, until almost nothing Latin remained standing. Survivors who managed to escape did so mostly by sea, a small number of Venetian and Pisan ships, slipping away from the harbor loaded with refugees who had witnessed their families murdered behind them. Estimates of the total death toll vary depending on the source, but contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe the Latin Quarter as effectively annihilated. Its population of tens of thousands reduced to a scattering of survivors, its buildings reduced to smoking ruins. Byzantine chroniclers, uncomfortable with the scale of the violence, tended to minimize their own city's culpability, while Western chroniclers, understandably, magnified Byzantine treachery and cruelty in their accounts. Between these competing distortions lies an agreed-upon core of horror. A prosperous, populous foreign community was annihilated inside the walls of one of the greatest cities on earth. In an eruption of communal violence that shocked even a medieval world accustomed to brutality, Andronikos rode this wave of anti-Latin fury directly to the throne. Within months he had eliminated the regency, had the young Alexios II strangled, married the boy's 12-year-old widow, and installed himself as sole emperor. The massacre had served its political purpose. But if Andronikos believed the bloodshed had secured Byzantine independence from Western influence, he had badly miscalculated the price that would eventually come due. In the West, the massacre was received with horror and outrage. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, the three powers whose citizens had been slaughtered and whose commercial empires had been gutted in a matter of days, did not forget. Merchants who had lost fathers, sons, and fortunes carried their fury home, and that fury did not fade with time. It calcified into a permanent grievance, a debt that Western Christendom felt Byzantium owed and had never repaid. That debt came due 22 years later. In 1204, a Crusader army that had originally set out for Egypt was diverted, through a tangle of debt, opportunism, and old resentment, toward Constantinople itself. The city that had massacred its Latin residents in 1182 was besieged, stormed, and subjected to a sack of staggering brutality by men who marched under the same cross the murdered Latins had once worn. Churches were stripped of their treasures, sacred relics were carried back to the West as trophies. And the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in Christendom, was looted and desecrated by soldiers who saw themselves not as invaders of a Christian city, but as men settling an old, unpaid account. Historians continue to debate how directly the events of 1182 caused the catastrophe of 1204, but the connection in the minds of the men who sacked Constantinople is difficult to dismiss. A wound inflicted on one Christian people by another, left to fester for a generation, returned in a form far more devastating than the original injury. A 1,000-year empire never fully recovering from the wound it received in payment for the blood it had spilled. What the massacre of the Latins reveals, stripped of its political framing, is how quickly a cosmopolitan, sophisticated city can turn into a killing ground when resentment is allowed to accumulate unaddressed for long enough, and how easily a population looking for someone to blame will accept the first leader willing to point a finger. The Latins of Constantinople were guilty of nothing beyond their prosperity and their difference, yet that was enough to condemn tens of thousands of them to death in a matter of days. And the vengeance their deaths eventually inspired proved just as indiscriminate, falling not on the mob that had killed them, but on a city, a culture, and an empire that outlived the men who had ordered the slaughter by only a few troubled decades. History rarely allows old blood to stay buried. In Constantinople's case, it waited 22 years, and then it came back for everything. Asterisk.